All right, so you want to talk iconic guitars, right? The ones that just make you want to crank it up to 11.
Yeah, I'm always up for geeking out about a good axe.
Me too, man, me too. And today's deep dive, we're tackling the Les Paul.
The granddaddy of them all. Where do we even begin with a guitar like that?
Well, buckle up, because
Yeah.
the stuff you dug up for us, this is like Les Paul legend, the deep cuts. We're talking vintage magazine articles, interviews with guys like Slash, even some crazy analysis of what made those old guitars sing.
That's the good stuff, man. But to really appreciate a Les Paul, you got to go back to the source.
Yeah, the man himself, Les Paul. Like, everyone knows he was a phenomenal guitarist, but
This was way more than just a guy who could shred. Les Paul was an innovator, obsessed with tone, decades before people even knew what that meant.
totally. We've got these old articles here talking about how he built his own recording equipment back in the 30s.
The man was a visionary. He heard the sound he wanted in his head, and if the technology didn't exist to create it, he just built it himself.
And that drive to innovate, that's what led him to the solid body guitar.
Absolutely. He was chasing sustain. Legend has it he even used a railroad track once just to see how long he could make a note ring out.
A railroad track. Talk about dedication.
That was Les Paul, always pushing boundaries, and that led him to build the Log, one of his first solid body prototypes.
The log? What's that?
Imagine a plank of wood with pickups screwed into it. Not pretty, but it proved his point about sustain and eliminating unwanted vibrations.
Okay, so I'm picturing Les Paul walking into Gibson with this log. What did they think?
Well, legend has it they called it the broomstick and basically laughed him out the door. Hard to believe now.
That they passed on the Les Paul. But, looking at all these interviews, it seems like Les wasn't too phased. Like, he knew what he was onto.
He had this unshakable confidence in his ideas, but he was also pragmatic. Like, the guy played country music for years just to make a living. As long as the sound quality was there, he was game.
That says a lot about him. Okay, so eventually, Gibson comes around, the Les Paul is born. But man, those early models were something else. They were like prototypes almost. Like, those first Telecasters were pretty basic too.
It's true, those early years were a wild west of guitar design. But take this 52 Gold Top you've got here in the deep dive materials. It's a perfect example, full of these little quirks even die-hard Les Paul fans wouldn't know about.
Okay, so what are we looking at with this 52? What makes it so unique?
Well, first off, the neck. It's unbound. Later models, they'd have that binding around the fretboard edges, but not this one.
Interesting. Okay, what else?
And then there's the tailpiece. It's a trapeze tailpiece.
Hold on, so no tunematic bridge. That's a pretty iconic Les Paul feature.
Nope, not on this one. The 52 has this trapeze tailpiece, and honestly, it wasn't ideal, combined with the neck angle.
The neck angle, what's that got to do with it?
So a steeper neck angle means better string tension, gives you lower action. But this 52, with that shallow angle and the trapeze tailpiece, getting a playable action was a nightmare.
I can imagine. So not the easiest guitar to play, these early Gold Tops.
Not exactly. And we're just scratching the surface here. Even the Gibson logo is different. It's called the kissing dot.
Kissing dot. Now that's a new one.
Yeah, look closely at the logo on the headstock. The dot on the I in Gibson, it literally touches the G.
Wow, that is a deep cut. I'm learning so much already.
It's these little details that make these early models so fascinating. They really were figuring it out as they went along.
Yeah, and you can kind of feel that evolution, right? Like
Yeah.
from those early Gold Tops to those late 50s bursts. It's like they cracked the code.
Talk about a glow up. Suddenly, you've got these guitars that define a generation of music. We're talking Joe Bonamassa, Dickie Betts, Gary Richrath, rock royalty.
And that sound,
Yeah.
it's legendary. But everyone always says it's all about the wood, right? That old growth Honduran mahogany.
It definitely played a part, but that's only part of the story. It's like saying a great meal is all about the produce. Sure, the ingredients are important, but it's how you use them.
That's what I'm talking about. So let's get into it. What are the real secrets to that 59 tone?
Well, like any good recipe, it's about the combination of ingredients, the pickups, the potentiometers, the capacitors. It all works together.
It's like that saying, right? The whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Exactly. And with the Les Paul, those parts are fascinating. Let's start with the pickups. What was it about those old PAF that made them so special?
Everyone talks about those El Nico magnets.
For good reason. Alnico gives them that warm, smooth tone that just melts your face off. But it's more than just the magnets. The way those coils were wound, it wasn't always precise. You'd get these little variations, even within a single pickup.
Wait, really? I always thought they were going for consistency back then.
Not necessarily. See, those little inconsistencies, they actually added something special to the sound. Created this push-pull effect in the magnetic field.
Huh, I never knew that. So are those vintage PAFs like the Holy Grail now? Is that the only way to get that sound?
You'd be surprised. There are some incredible PAF replicas out there now. They've really studied the originals down to the wire. But honestly, and this is in your research here, sometimes adjusting your pickups can make a bigger difference than the pickups themselves.
No way. Seriously.
Seriously, pickup height, the height of each pole piece, it all impacts your tone.
It's like fine-tuning an engine, right? Getting everything perfectly balanced.
Exactly. Little tweaks can make a huge difference. All right, so we've got pickups, but what about the pots? Those vintage pots are legendary.
Yeah, what's the deal with those? Everyone says they're different.
It's all about the taper. How the resistance changes when you turn the knob. Vintage Les Paul pots, they have this smooth taper that just lets the guitar clean up so nicely.
But those vintage pots are like unobtainium now, right?
Let's just say they're not cheap. But the good news is, some modern companies are making pots with that vintage style taper. And get this, your research actually had a blind test, and some of the less expensive pots sounded just as good, if not better, than the super pricey boutique ones.
You're kidding. See, this is why I love these deep dives. Always busting myths. Okay, so we've covered pickups, pots. What's left?
The capacitors, the unsung heroes of the tone circuit.
Ah, yes, the bumblebee capacitors. Those things are the stuff of legend.
They're cool, no doubt. But even those old capacitors, they've drifted from their original specs over time. And honestly, modern capacitors can achieve those same sonic characteristics just as well. Some even say they're more reliable.
So it's less about hunting down those vintage parts and more about understanding what each component does.
Exactly. It's about finding what sounds best to you. Your ears, your guitar. That's the beauty of it.
This has been eye-opening, man. I feel like I'm hearing Les Pauls in a whole new light. And you know, it makes you think about all those legendary guitarists who made the Les Paul their own. Slash, Billy Gibbons, Jimmy Page. They weren't chasing specs, they were chasing a feeling.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And now, thanks to this deep dive, maybe our listeners can tap into that same feeling too. Whether they're rocking a vintage burst or a brand new Les Paul, it's all about exploring, experimenting, and finding your own voice. And you know what? There's one last thing that really got me thinking in all of this. Remember how we talked about those guys ripping out the old Kluson tuners in the 60s to put Grovers on?
Yeah, it was all the rage back then.
Right. But we just spent all this time talking about getting closer to vintage specs. What if, and this is just a thought, what if those upgrades they did back then, what if those actually changed the sound in ways they loved but couldn't quite explain? Something to think about, right?
There you go. Always more to explore. That's what keeps it interesting.
Absolutely. So to everyone listening, let us know what you discover. Try those pickup adjustments, experiment with different capacitors. We want to hear about your quest for the perfect Les Paul tone. Until next time, keep on rocking.